The phone hasn't stopped ringing for 11 minutes. I count because counting keeps my hand steady around the coffee mug. Margaret's name flashes across the screen for the fourth time, then Caleb's, then a number I don't recognize. Somewhere behind those calls in a country club ballroom, 200 miles from this lake, my husband's family is watching the future they built collapse in real time. They think I did this to them. They think I planned everything. What they don't know is that I've been waiting 6 weeks for a sealed envelope to expose a lie that has lasted 12 years. I let the phone ring until it goes quiet. It's a Saturday morning in early June, the kind of morning that once meant nothing more than opening the windows and letting the cool lake breeze drift through the house. I'm sitting at the small pine table in the cabin I bought for myself in Door County, Wisconsin, 3 years ago. Back then, I thought I'd only need it for the occasional weekend escape. I never imagined I'd be living here full-time. I never imagined how much my life would change. The coffee in my hands has already gone lukewarm. Outside the window, the lake lies calm and silver beneath a sky that can't decide whether to rain. Somewhere across that water, 300 guests are gathered at Larkspur Country Club. They're dressed in linen and pearls, waiting for William Jenkins to hand his company over to his oldest son. There are place cards, a string quartet, and even a cake with a small gold J on top, because apparently, even a baby who hasn't been born yet needs a monogram. I know all this because Rachel told me the schedule 2 days ago in the calm, careful voice she uses whenever she's trying to hide her real thoughts. Rachel Hayes has been my attorney for 11 years, and in all that time, I've never heard her sound as exhausted as she did during that call. "You don't have to go," she said. "I wasn't planning to," I replied. Then I open the folder and look again at the page on top, the one with Dr. Bennett's letterhead, the one that's been sitting in my possession for 12 years, quiet as a held breath. 6 weeks ago, they laid $2 million on a table in front of me and believed I'd just sold off my whole life for it. They had no idea I'd already seen the first result years before any of this began. To understand what's happening in that ballroom right now, you have to go back to the night they called me to the house, the night I learned exactly how little I was worth to them and exactly how much. They still didn't know. 6 weeks earlier, Caleb came home at 11:00 at night, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he didn't bother pretending he'd been at the office. He stood in the doorway of our bedroom, still wearing his suit jacket, tie loosened, and said it the way you'd announce a merger. "Madison's pregnant." I was sitting up in with a book I wasn't really reading. I remember setting it down slowly, giving myself that half second to arrange my face before I looked at him. 23 years of marriage teaches you things about timing. "Congratulations," I said, and I meant it to sting, though I'm not sure it landed the way I intended. He didn't flinch. That was the part that told me how far things had already gone without me. "It's a boy," he said, like the sex of the child settled something. "The family needs to move quickly before this gets out." By the family, he meant his family. By moves quickly, I would learn within the hour he meant me. They sent a car for me that same night, not Caleb driving, but the Jenkins family car, black and silent. As if I were already a piece of business to be transported, rather than a wife to be spoken with. I remember looking out the windows at the streets of a city I'd lived in for 2 decades, and thinking how strange it was that none of it looked different when everything about my life was about to. The house on Willowmere Drive was lit up when I arrived, every window glowing like they were staging something for a magazine, and in a sense they were. The living room held Margaret in a chair positioned like a throne, William in his usual place by the fireplace, though he didn't rise when I entered, Caleb standing too close to Madison on the sofa. And Charles Whitmore, the family attorney, seated at the low table with a leather folder already open in front of him. Madison had one hand resting on her stomach, though she couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 weeks along. It was a gesture, not a fact. I noticed that immediately, how practiced it looked, how rehearsed. Charles slid the folder toward me before anyone said hello. $2 million, $7 days to vacate the house, silence on the affair permanent and binding, no contact with press, a full release of any claim to marital assets, no objection ever to Caleb's remarriage. I read every line twice while the room watched me, and I remember thinking that if they expected tears, they were about to be disappointed in a way that would cost them. "This is more than most women your age could hope to walk away with," Margaret said, folding her hands in her lap like she was doing me a kindness. Madison chose that exact moment to let a tear slide down her cheek, and Margaret reached over without looking to pat her knee, already choosing sides in a war that hadn't started for me yet. "I don't want to hurt you," Caleb said, and for one second I almost believed there was something underneath the words. "But this is the family's future. Are you certain it's yours?" I asked. The room went still in the particular way rooms go still right before someone raises their voice. Caleb's face darkened. "Are you going to insult the mother of my child in this house?" Madison cried harder right on cue, and Margaret was at her side instantly murmuring something protective. I didn't argue. I had learned a long time ago that arguing with a room that has already decided the ending only wastes your breath. Instead, I made my own requests. I wanted the full 2 million wired that same night, not staggered, not delayed. I wanted every document notarized before I left the house. I wanted explicit language stating the payment did not touch any business shares held in my name, and I wanted it written that no terms could be altered after signing. Charles skimmed the shares clause quickly and told the room my holdings were negligible, a formality left over from the early years. Margaret, eager to be finished with me, agreed without argument. I signed. Madison smiled the way a woman smiles when she believes she's just won something permanent. Caleb exhaled like a man who'd been holding his breath for days. Margaret told me she knew I'd do the sensible thing. "You never actually knew me," I told her, and I watched that land somewhere behind her eyes, though she wouldn't have admitted it. Caleb followed me out to the car. He asked why I wasn't screaming, why I wasn't begging him to reconsider, why I wasn't behaving like a woman whose marriage had just ended in a room full of witnesses. "Because I stopped fighting for things that had already lost their value," I said, and got into the car before he could find a response. The money landed in my account before midnight, exactly as I'd demanded. I sat at my kitchen table, still my kitchen, for 6 more days and went through the wire details with the kind of attention I'd once used auditing the company's quarterly filings. Back when Caleb still asked for my opinion instead of assuming I had none. The receipt listed a routing number, timestamp, and source of funds. It didn't come from Margaret's personal account, and it didn't come from William's either. The money came from the Jenkins Legacy Trust, a fund reserved for a confirmed future heir. I sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time, turning that fact over in my mind like a stone hiding something underneath. Then I picked up my phone and called Rachel Hayes. "They just paid me," I said, using money that was set aside for a child who hasn't even been proven to belong to this family. The next morning, I moved into a Marriott off Route 41. The lobby smelled of chlorine and burnt coffee, nothing like the house on Cedarbrook where I'd spent 18 years building a life. Somehow it felt right. A fresh start in a place that made no effort to be anything more than it was. Rachel arrived that afternoon carrying 2 coffees and a legal pad. We spread the wire transfer documents across the small round table by the window. She studied them quietly, the kind of silence that meant she was putting the pieces together. "This transfer needed board approval," she finally said. "Trust payouts above a certain amount always do, but I only see Margaret's signature and Charles's countersign." "Is that enough?" I asked. "For now, but if anyone looks closely, a payment from a trust meant for a confirmed heir, before any heir has actually been confirmed, is going to raise serious questions. Most trusts like this have automatic audit triggers for transfers made without proper verification." She looked up at me. "And you never signed away your shares." "Whatever they think they bought from you, it wasn't that." I hadn't told her why I wasn't worried, why I'd sat quietly in that living room, signed my name, and let Madison cry only a few feet away. Rachel had been my attorney for over 10 years, but there was one thing even she didn't know. I reached into my bag and pulled out an old envelope, its edges worn with age. 12 years old, I said, sliding it across the table. She opened it and read in silence. Her expression slowly shifted from confusion to disbelief. 12 years earlier, Caleb had been diagnosed with early-stage prostate cancer. He was still under 40, and it terrified him in a way I'd never seen before. He went through treatment quietly, telling no one outside our marriage because he feared what his father would think of a son whose own body had failed him. The follow-up tests showed the cancer was gone, but another line in the report changed everything: permanent infertility. It was a result of the treatment. Only 3 people ever knew: Caleb, me, and Dr. Laura Bennett, who had cared for both of us for years. Caleb made me promise that his family would never find out. I understood why. In that family, a man who couldn't produce an heir was worth less than the furniture. So when Caleb told you Madison was pregnant, Rachel said slowly, you already knew it couldn't be his biological child. I knew it shouldn't have been possible, I replied. But people believe what they want to believe, especially men like Caleb. Madison claimed it happened after a conference months earlier. Caleb wanted a son so badly that he stopped questioning what he already knew. Still, I didn't want to rely on a 12-year-old document alone. That evening, I called Dr. Bennett. She confirmed the old records still existed, though she couldn't discuss Caleb's medical information without his consent. Doctor-patient confidentiality didn't disappear just because our marriage had ended, but there was one thing she could tell me. Years earlier, when we'd gone through fertility treatments together, I'd been listed as a joint party on those records. That meant I still had legal access to part of the file. Then, almost as if fate decided to hand me one more clue, an email arrived from our old insurance provider. My name still hadn't been removed from the family policy during the divorce process. Buried among the notifications was a scheduling confirmation. Madison had booked a non-invasive prenatal paternity test, results expected in 3 weeks. I read that sentence 4 times before setting my phone down. Rachel warned me immediately, don't interfere, don't tell them what you know, let them put the truth on paper themselves. Don't give them a chance to bury it first. She was right. Even though part of me wanted to walk into that house and watch their faces when everything fell apart, I stayed silent. I'd spent 23 years being patient with that family. I could wait 3 more weeks. Meanwhile, the Jenkins family's public relations campaign quietly began. Mutual friends were told that our marriage had been over for years, that I'd accepted the settlement out of self-interest. And that Caleb and Madison had simply found each other during a difficult time and shouldn't be judged. A photographer had already been booked for their future generation announcement. Then 3 days before I left the hotel, I got a call from an old colleague still working in the finance department. She said legal had quietly requested her to adjust the approval date on my wire transfer, to make it look like it had cleared the board weeks earlier than it actually had. That was the moment I understood. They weren't just hiding an affair anymore. They knew on some level that the transaction wasn't clean. That night a text arrived from a number I didn't recognize. If you want to know who really approved that money, ask Owen where he was the night Madison says she conceived. I read it twice sitting alone in that hotel room with the hum of the highway outside the window and felt something in my chest go very still and very cold. The woman texted me again the next morning, this time asking to meet. She introduced herself as Claire Morris, an audit assistant in the finance division. Someone I vaguely remembered from company holiday parties, always polite, always in the background, the kind of employee who notices everything and says nothing until she has a reason to. She wasn't ready to meet in person yet, she said, but she wanted me to have something first. Over the next 2 days, she sent me pieces one at a time, like she was testing whether I could be trusted with the whole picture before handing it over. Owen had requested elevated access to trust fund records 6 weeks before Madison's pregnancy became public. He'd met with Madison multiple times outside any work schedule that made sense. There was a hotel charge in Milwaukee, the room booked under a name that didn't match anyone on the guest list for that week's supposed business trip. And Caleb hadn't even been in Milwaukee the night Madison claimed the child was conceived. I didn't believe it right away. 23 years with a man teaches you his lies, but it also teaches you not to trust every accusation that lands on your desk, especially one from a stranger. So I checked it myself. I still had access to an old shared calendar, one nobody had thought to remove me from in the chaos of the divorce. The night in question, Caleb had been in Denver with William and 3 board members locked in meetings about a stalled development deal. I remembered him complaining about it at the time, the long flight, the tedious contract language, how he'd missed my birthday dinner because of it. Madison had been in Milwaukee that same week, so had Owen. Once I let myself look, the smaller things came rushing back, things I'd noticed and dismissed for years without letting myself add them together. Owen always stepping in to defend Madison whenever Caleb criticized her work, Madison knowing details about deals that should have stayed inside Owen's office. The 2 of them leaving the same holiday party within minutes of each other more than once, Owen more than anyone pushing Caleb toward a fast, clean divorce. Rachel, when I called her, was more cautious than I was. Don't let this become a story you're telling yourself because it's satisfying, she said. "We need documents, we need the test results." Speculation doesn't hold up in a courtroom, and it definitely doesn't hold up in that family. She was right. And I made myself sit with the discomfort of not knowing instead of rushing toward a conclusion that felt too convenient. Meanwhile, the Jenkins family moved forward as if none of this existed. A photographer was hired for a next-generation announcement shoot. Caleb's hand resting proudly over Madison's still flat stomach, both of them dressed in soft, neutral tones meant to suggest new beginnings. Margaret called me that same week, her voice brisk and businesslike, asking me to sign an additional document, this one waiving my voting rights within the company entirely. I refused. "That stake exists because of this family," Margaret said, clearly startled that I hadn't simply agreed. "No," I said. "I bought it with my own money back when the company was nearly bankrupt and nobody else wanted to risk a cent on it. Nobody gave me anything, Margaret." I earned every percentage point. There was a long pause on the line and I could almost hear her doing the math she should have done years earlier. 18%. That was what I still held quietly in a trust of my own, untouched by the divorce settlement, because I'd made certain of it the night I signed those papers. Without it, Caleb couldn't reach the voting threshold he needed to replace William as chairman. He called me an hour later, furious. "You tricked me." "No," I said. "You simply never read what I actually owned." That evening, Claire finally agreed to meet in person at a quiet diner off the interstate where nobody from either of our old lives would think to look. She slid a manila envelope across the table, a copy of the trust's approval log, the Milwaukee hotel records, and a small digital recorder. I pressed play right there in the booth, my coffee going cold in front of me. It was Owen's voice, unmistakable, low, and confident in the way men get when they think no one important is listening. "We just need Caleb to believe the baby is his until the transfer of power is finalized." Madison's voice followed, quieter. "And Abigail, $2 million will make her disappear." I sat very still, listening to my own erasure being planned in real time by two people I'd once trusted enough to invite into my home. Claire watched my face carefully, as if gauging how much more I could absorb in one sitting. There was more on the recording, the sound of ice in a glass, a door closing somewhere in the background, and then Madison's voice again, this time with an edge I hadn't heard in her before. Something colder underneath all that practiced softness. "And once Caleb has the company," she said, "what do we do with him?" 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, the Jenkins family threw the kind of party they'd always been good at. The kind built on white tablecloths and rehearsed smiles, where every detail existed to tell a story about who they were rather than who they actually were. I know this only because Rachel described it to me afterward, piece by piece, since I wasn't there to see it firsthand. I'd chosen the lake instead. The guest list read like a who's who of everyone who mattered to the Jenkins name: board members, investors, banking partners. Old money friends who'd known William since his own father ran the company, and a scattering of relatives who showed up mostly for the open bar. The agenda, as Rachel understood it, was simple and triumphant. Announce that Madison was carrying a boy, announce Caleb's engagement, have William formally hand over the reins of the company to his son, secure board approval for a new development phase, and present the unborn child as the living symbol of the family's stability for another generation. I sat with Rachel at my kitchen table that morning, carefully reviewing 3 documents she had prepared the day before. One protected my shareholder rights, another requested an internal audit of the trust transaction, and the third asked the board to delay any vote on transferring executive control until the audit was complete. "Timing is everything," Rachel had told me. "We don't stop them, we make sure the truth arrives when they have nowhere left to hide." It arrived just before William was scheduled to speak. An auditor from the trust's oversight firm walked into the ballroom, invited by the paperwork alone, and requested a private meeting with the board before the ceremony began. The news spread through the room in quiet whispers and uneasy glances. The findings were simple but devastating. The $2 million payment had been taken from a fund reserved only for a confirmed future heir. The approval signature appeared to have been added after the transaction, not during the original authorization period. Until the issue was resolved, any transfer of executive authority had to be suspended, and the identity of the future heir would need to be officially verified. Less than 10 minutes later, a courier arrived with a sealed envelope addressed to Caleb. It contained the prenatal paternity test results that had taken 3 weeks to complete. Madison tried to stop him from opening it, but Caleb refused. He opened the envelope in front of nearly 300 guests. The ballroom fell completely silent. Caleb had been excluded as the biological father. Within a minute, Margaret called me in panic, demanding to know what I had done. "Nothing," I replied, standing by my kitchen window and watching the lake move as if nothing had happened. "I didn't write those results, and I didn't send that auditor." "I've been here all morning." Caleb grabbed the phone, his voice shaking. "You knew. I knew what was impossible," I answered calmly. "I simply let you believe what you wanted." Madison insisted the test had to be wrong, claiming it was some kind of laboratory mistake. But the auditor explained that the confidence level was extremely high. An expanded DNA comparison showed that a close male relative of Caleb was far more likely to be the father. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward Owen. He denied it immediately, too quickly. That was when I sent William and Charles Whitmore the recording Claire had given me. In it, Owen told Madison they only needed Caleb to believe the baby was his until the transfer of power was complete. Rachel later told me William listened to the entire recording without saying a word. When it ended, he looked directly at his younger son. Caleb lunged at Owen, but security stepped in before the fight could escalate. In the middle of the chaos, Madison finally admitted the truth. She had slept with both brothers. But it was Owen who had planned everything with her. I sat quietly at my kitchen table long after Rachel finished telling me what had happened. My coffee had gone cold, and outside the lake kept moving as though the world hadn't changed at all. Later that evening, Rachel called again. "The DNA test only destroyed the lie about the baby," she said quietly. "The financial records are going to destroy everything else." 3 days later, the Jenkins Development Group called an emergency board meeting. For the first time in 23 years, I walked into that building not as someone's wife, but as a shareholder whose voice could no longer be ignored. The conference room was packed. Caleb sat at one end, refusing to look at Owen. Owen had hired his own attorney, making it clear the family was already falling apart. Margaret looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. William sat at the head of the table with a face as hard as stone. Madison arrived pale and exhausted, her pregnancy no longer a symbol of victory, but evidence. Charles Whitmore sat beside the auditor and a bank representative. Rachel took the seat next to me, but this time I asked to speak for myself. Owen tried to place all the blame on Madison, claiming he had only given her advice. She turned toward him with real anger. "He promised he'd marry me," she said, after Caleb was pushed out of the company. As the truth unfolded, the entire plan became clear. The baby was meant to push Caleb into the chairman's position. Once he had control, Owen would expose the financial problems he had secretly helped create, forcing Caleb out in disgrace. Madison would threaten to reveal the affair if anyone resisted, and Owen would step in as the perfect replacement. The $2 million payment had been the first move, designed to remove me from the marriage and keep me from interfering. What they never expected was that I still owned 18% of the company, giving me the legal right to demand a full audit. When it was finally my turn to speak, I remained calm. I stated exactly what I wanted. The company would issue a public correction, making it clear that I had never accepted a payout in exchange for my silence. The confidentiality agreement I'd signed would be rewritten, so it could never again be used to bury wrongdoing. The $2 million would be reclassified as a legitimate personal settlement drawn from Caleb's and the family's own assets, with full repayment made to the trust it had been improperly taken from. Owen would be suspended pending a formal investigation. Madison would be released from her position, though her medical and maternity coverage would remain fully protected. None of this was the child's fault. Caleb would not be appointed chairman. An independent director would run the company for no less than a year, and I would keep my shares along with my seat on the board. Margaret's composure finally cracked. "You're punishing us," she said. "This is revenge." "Revenge is wanting you to suffer," I said. "I only want you to stop using my name to cover up what you did." Caleb asked to speak with me privately for a moment. And I let him mostly because I wanted to see once, and for all what was actually left of the man I'd married. He asked quietly if there had ever been a point where I'd tried to save our marriage. "I saved it for 23 years, I told him. "You just never noticed because I did it quietly." He admitted then in a voice stripped of all its usual certainty that he'd known for a long time his odds of fathering a child were nearly non-existent. But he'd wanted so badly to prove something to his father that he chose to believe Madison anyway, chose to stop asking the questions that would have unraveled everything sooner. "You didn't love the baby," I said. "You loved what you thought the baby would prove about you." He had nothing to say to that. William, when the vote finally came, refused to hand control to either son. He cast his vote for the independent director instead, his voice flat and final, a man closing a chapter he'd clearly been rewriting in his head all week. Every condition I'd laid out was approved without further argument. Afterward, in the hallway outside the conference room, Caleb caught up with me one last time. "After all this," he said, "you're still keeping the $2 million. I looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had once been my whole life, and was now something closer to a stranger standing in a hallway. "No," I said, "I've decided to use it for something your family never understood. I never gave the $2 million back to Caleb." Under the terms we'd settled on in that conference room, the Jenkins family repaid the trust fund from their own personal holdings, dollar for dollar, exactly as it should have been from the start. What I'd received that first night was legally and finally mine, clean, documented, no longer tangled up in anyone else's lie. I didn't buy a bigger house with it. I didn't buy a car meant to announce anything to anyone. Instead, I sat at the same pine table where this whole story had circled back to its beginning, and I started something with a name that came to me almost fully formed, the way true sometimes do. The Second Chapter Fund. It exists for women over 45 who find themselves starting over after everything they built quietly falls apart around them. After divorce, after financial control wielded like a weapon, after being pushed out of family businesses they helped create, after years spent raising children or supporting a spouse's career. Only to re-enter a workforce that's forgotten they exist. Legal consultation, career retraining, short-term housing assistance, financial planning, counseling for the kind of grief that doesn't come with a funeral. I kept my seat on the Jenkins Development Group board because 18% doesn't disappear just because a marriage does. And because someone needed to make sure the company's new independent director actually held to the terms we'd agreed on. But I didn't go back to running things day to day. That chapter had already closed itself quietly over 23 years of me standing just behind the curtain. Caleb resigned as CEO 6 months later. He moved into a small apartment across town and started seeing a therapist, something I never once heard him consider necessary during our entire marriage. I don't know if it's helping him. I've stopped needing to know. Owen was formally charged with financial misconduct, falsifying trust records, and misappropriating funds meant for a beneficiary who never existed. The case is still working its way through the courts. Madison gave birth to a healthy boy that autumn. The DNA results, once fully processed, confirmed what everyone in the ballroom had already suspected. Owen was the father. I never hated the child, and I want to make that clear. A baby is never responsible for the lies that brought them into the world. Margaret lost most of her influence in the company almost overnight. Power has a way of disappearing when it's built on deception. William restructured the trust completely, placing it under independent oversight so that no single family member could ever decide alone who deserved to be called an heir. A year after that ballroom fell silent around a sealed envelope, I stood inside the small office we had rented for the fund's first real headquarters. It wasn't fancy, just clean walls, warm light, and a row of chairs for women who would walk through the door unsure of how to ask for help. The first woman who came in was 56, a widow who had discovered only 3 months earlier that her late husband had secretly left most of his estate to a second family she never knew existed. I sat beside her instead of across from her because I remembered what it felt like to be treated like a problem instead of a person. Starting over doesn't mean you've lost everything, I told her. Sometimes it simply means you finally get to keep the one thing that was always truly yours. That evening, I drove back to the lake house. The folder labeled Jenkins Divorce was still sitting in a drawer I hadn't opened for months. I placed a new folder beside it, Second Chapter, Fund First Year. My phone buzzed on the table. It wasn't Caleb, it wasn't Margaret, it never is anymore. That chapter had already closed itself quietly over 23 years of me standing just behind the curtain. Caleb resigned as CEO 6 months later. He moved into a small apartment across town and started seeing a therapist, something I never once heard him consider necessary during our entire marriage. I don't know if it's helping him. I've stopped needing to know. Owen was formally charged with financial misconduct, falsifying trust records, and misappropriating funds meant for a beneficiary who never existed. The case is still working its way through the courts. Madison gave birth to a healthy boy that autumn. The DNA results, once fully processed, confirmed what everyone in the ballroom had already suspected. Owen was the father. I never hated the child, and I want to make that clear. A baby is never responsible for the lies that brought them into the world. Margaret lost most of her influence in the company almost overnight. Power has a way of disappearing when it's built on deception. William restructured the trust completely, placing it under independent oversight so that no single family member could ever decide alone who deserved to be called an heir. A year after that ballroom fell silent around a sealed envelope, I stood inside the small office we had rented for the fund's first real headquarters. It wasn't fancy, just clean walls, warm light, and a row of chairs for women who would walk through the door unsure of how to ask for help. The first woman who came in was 56, a widow who had discovered only 3 months earlier that her late husband had secretly left most of his estate to a second family she never knew existed. I sat beside her instead of across from her because I remembered what it felt like to be treated like a problem instead of a person. Starting over doesn't mean you've lost everything, I told her. Sometimes it simply means you finally get to keep the one thing that was always truly yours. That evening, I drove back to the lake house. The folder labeled Jenkins' divorce was still sitting in a drawer I hadn't opened for months. I placed a new folder beside it, second chapter, fund first year. My phone buzzed on the table. It wasn't Caleb, it wasn't Margaret, it never is anymore. It was a message from one of our caseworkers. A woman we had helped in March had just accepted a job offer and received her first paycheck in 11 years. I smiled quietly as the evening light turned the lake golden outside the window. They believed $2 million was enough to make me disappear. Instead, it became the money that helped me finally show up again, not as someone's wife, but as the woman I had been putting off becoming for more than 20 years. If you were Abigail, would you have signed those papers and let the truth reveal itself in its own time? Or would you have confronted Caleb the moment he walked through the door? I'd love to know what you would have done. Tell me in the comments where you're watching or listening from. We share new stories like this every day, so subscribe and stay with us, because this is only the beginning of the journeys we'll take together.